Welcome back to International Relations 101. I'm William Spaniel. Today's topic is economic interdependence, and we begin with a statistical finding. Countries that trade with each other tend not to fight each other. This is true for both militarized interstate disputes and full-fledged wars. And this statistical finding is actually controlling for other factors. This is a subtle barrier to making this inference, actually. Countries that share a border with each other are simultaneously more likely to trade with each other and more likely to fight each other. Both of those things should make sense. If you think back to the previous unit, one of the biggest barriers to trade was the cost of transportation. If it's very expensive to ship goods from country A to country B, country A is less likely to do that. They're more likely to consume those goods domestically. Military-wise, if you share a border, you're more likely to fight. This is for two reasons. One, if you share that border, you're more likely to have something in dispute, and perhaps it's the border itself. And two, if you're next to each other, it's much easier to militarily invade the other side. The costs of war are relatively low as compared to having a long distance to traverse. What this statistical relationship is telling us is that if you account for that distance, you see a decrease in conflict as trade increases. So two countries that share a border and trade with each other are less likely to fight than two countries that share a border and don't trade with each other. Similarly, if you have two countries that don't share a border and trade with each other, they're less likely to fight than two countries that don't share a border and don't trade with each other. That being said, we can't conclude that this is a causal relationship. Correlation does not imply causation. We've seen that before. And there's a good reason to think that perhaps the causal relationship goes the other way around. Maybe it's not trade that causes peace, but peace that causes trade. A pair of countries that don't expect to fight each other anytime soon would seem to have more incentive to invest in that trade relationship. Nevertheless, what we want to answer here in this lecture is whether there is some sort of causal explanation for why trade might cause peace. Can we think of a causal relationship between those two? Can we use theory to figure that sort of thing out? And the answer is yes. We just need to go back to the last two units and combine them together. In the last unit, we saw that trade creates a surplus, and that splitting that surplus makes everyone better off. Country A invests in the product that it is comparatively better at making. Country B invests in the product that it's comparatively better making. They both produce a lot of stuff, they trade with each other, and there's ultimately more stuff consumed by everyone through that trade relationship. 2 units ago, we saw that the range of mutually preferable settlements grows larger as the costs of war grow. Well, if you are at war with one another, it's not really easy to trade with each other. Try to imagine telling a shipping vehicle to go into a harbor which is in the middle of a war zone. It's probably not going to happen. So if you're fighting with each other, you're not trading with each other, which means you're not enjoying the trade surplus, which is functionally making the costs of war higher. We can see this visually. Here is a bargaining situation with two countries when they're not trading with one another. This is exactly what we've seen before. There's some probability of victory, there are costs for war for both parties, and these costs create a bargaining range, which is the set of settlements that are mutually preferable to war. Now let's imagine that these same two countries, for whatever reason, maybe there's some sort of sudden technological development that makes the cost of transportation lower, these two countries now start trading with each other. What does that look like? Well, in addition to paying your costs for war C, you're also paying some sort of lost trade surplus T. And so we subtract out those costs for both players. We see that A's share of surplus is now moving the set of settlements that A is willing to accept even further to the left, and we see that the trade surplus for B is making the sorts of settlements that B is willing to accept further to the right. This has the effect of making that bargaining range bigger. It's very easy to compare. If you just look at the last two slides, we see that the bargaining range with trade is larger than the bargaining range without trade. And so this gives us a causal explanation for why trade causes peace. Trade makes war less appealing, and the less appealing war is, the less likely bargaining breaks down for most explanations for war. And I do need to emphasize that last bit. It's the case for very few mechanisms for war. Some of those rationalist explanations for war that we've seen previously, for some explanations, if you have increases to the cost of war that aren't too large, you can actually increase the probability of fighting, which is very counterintuitive. You can make war less appealing and simultaneously make it more appealing. But those sorts of mechanisms are the exception and not the rule. So on the whole, what we would expect is that by increasing the cost of war through trade, we would expect the overall prevalence of war to go down. And that's what we do see in the empirical literature on this. Hope you enjoyed this lecture on economic interdependence, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.